The 2017 Honda Civic. I've already done an extensive video on it. If you want all the details of it, just watch that because I'm not going to rehash it all over again. But this isn't a coupe. It's not an EX. This has 4 doors and it's the SI. I'm sure you're getting excited already. Now I've had a chance to drive the 4-door and the 2-door version of this, and I've got video of both in the same color. And I think it's just a question of taste. What do you prefer? I had the 2-door version on track, and one of my first impressions within literally 20 seconds of driving it was this.
Well, it doesn't take much time to figure out that this car is probably the fastest SI ever made.
Now, before I get into all the impressions, I talked to Peter Delaplane, used to own a car company, and he said, what's the best Civic SI ever? And I said, Peter, look, it's a generational thing. Each generation Civic has a new generation owner, usually, and that's going to skew what you think's the best. I think the 6th and the 8th generation Civic SI are hands down one of the most exciting to drive. But then you come to this. Is it any better? Well, I can tell you one thing, it's certainly not the worst. That's been reserved for very specific generations. But again, this is something, much like styling, is going to depend on who you are and where you came from. Let's get right down to the styling, okay? The biggest problem for me with the Civic is something that can be changed with a refresh, and it's one of the most complained about parts of this car. This crap. These faux, fake, massive pieces of plastic that are supposed to be vent work. Now granted, there's a tiny little hole here where you can get air in, but the other one's blocked off, and they replicate this cheesiness right into the back bumpers. Now you're sitting there thinking, Theodore, why are you cherry picking awkward angles? Well, it's because I can, I'm making the video. Things like these panel gaps and the hood and the trunk. The awkwardness of some of the lines. This is not my favorite looking Civic by a long stretch, but there's plenty of people that share that and think this just looks hideous. I don't think it looks hideous. There's some people that say it looks amazing, but one thing I will say is I will take this any day over what they did with the previous generation Civic, where it looks like the designers popped a bunch of sleeping pills before they went into work. This has something. It makes you think something, feel something, whether you just feel disgusted or you feel compelled looking at it. And that's the sign of an interesting car. So let's move on to the back. Well, if you look at it, it certainly doesn't look as oddly proportioned as the coupe. This flows much better. You know, some people really like the taillight design, all that. Again, it's subjective. But then we get to this horror movie event down here with these fake shutters, vents. I just want to put a paper bag over them and be done. It's just nonsensical to me, but let's not talk about that anymore. Let's go to the trunk. And this trunk's bigger than the coupe, and it makes it a hell of a lot more usable. In fact, I was able to fit these massive tubes. I mean, literally massive tubes, 96 inches long, all the way to the front and the back, and transport them. And you know, you start to get creative when you're loading stuff in here, and you realize with the seats down, you don't need a hatchback sometimes. You don't need a small SUV to have practical stuff for your everyday use. And I really like this car in terms of usability. But you know what? I'm tired of drooling over it. Let's take a look at the interior. It's an SI. You know how you know it's an SI? It says it on the seats. There's no guesswork. And then you see the red stitching all over the doors. This fake carbon fiber trim. And of course, when you turn on the car, you see in the gauge cluster that it's an SI. But other than that, this feels very much like the 4-door Civic or the Civic Coupe. All the good things are still here from those cars. They've just kind of tweaked them to make this feel a little bit more special. Now, my favorite part about this car's interior is these cloth seats. There's no leather anywhere on them. And the side effect is they run extremely cool, they are extremely grippy, and the way the bolstering is set up, I feel just so comfortable all the time. And it makes me just wish for these types of seats in every car, or at least an option. This is one of the best implementations of a comfortable, sporty seat on this earth. Now I'm going to shut this door. My mom says I need to get more intimate with people so we can connect better. Let's talk about the negatives, because there are a few, and it's shared with the regular Civic. This infotainment screen, for one, it is a fingerprint magnet. It looks like there's about 3 pounds of skin and dust all over it. This is what you get with touchscreens like this in any car. But the worst part is it does not have a volume knob, and you have to use a friggin' touch thing to turn up the volume, and you're pretty much trapped into using the steering wheel control, and expect to see this changed in the mid-cycle refresh, much like the bumpers. The second thing that bothers me is this shift knob. It's not that it's not great, and when you first grip it, you're like, man, I like it, until it gets really hot out. And I put my hand on this the other day, and I almost burned the shift pattern into my hand like a brand, because it does, it gets really hot. And you know, as much as I like the design, I think it probably should just be fully leather wrapped to avoid that. There is some other cheesiness here, like this seat heater panel and the HVAC controls. This whole panel completely moves when you touch it. Even when you're pushing the seat heater buttons, this whole thing, it feels like it needs a backing plate behind it to support it. And you can feel a little gap. I don't know if they left it out here, but it's something that needs to be fixed. The second thing is, it's like they didn't think about manual transmission drivers. When you go into first, oftentimes I will hit the seat heater button with my thumb if I'm shifting. And if you have bigger hands, I think you'll hit this quite often, and you have a nice surprise in the summer when your seat's 1,000 degrees. But other than that, really, all the good things are here from the regular Civic. I'm not gonna rehash all of them. The last few things to mention about the SI, and some really positive things here, is, you notice up here, there's no sensors. There's no massive bulk of electronics, and that's because this does not have frontal crash mitigation. It doesn't have a front camera system. It doesn't have radar cruise control. It doesn't have blind spot monitoring. Really, the only thing that it has is the side camera and the rear view camera in terms of technology. Other than that, you just have a traction control on and off button, and that is a huge pro of this car if you're somebody that just, you know, wants a more pure driving experience, well, as pure as you can get from a modern car. This is something I don't typically talk about with newer cars because, well, manual transmissions are disappearing. But it's strange to talk about it with a Honda, and I don't ever have a problem with this, or I figure it out. But I have a really hard time heel-to-toe downshifting this car, rev match downshifting it. And it's largely because the brake pedal and the accelerator pedal are very far apart. This is one of the few cars I feel like favors somebody with a bigger foot. I wear a size 9, which is kind of girly by most standards. If you have something over like 10 or 11, I would say this would almost be perfect. But I have to get really high up on the brake pedal to heel to toe. I can't sidestep it either without slipping off the brake pedal. So that's something you're gonna wanna try. It's one of the most annoying parts of the experience of driving this car for me. But speaking of which, we're gonna take this to the shop and see Turbowski and see what he has to say about his majesty. Scott, this could be the last time in Shoppe version 1.0.
Possibly.
Possibly, but probably not. This is something we've already looked at, the Honda Civic, the 10th generation version. Now we saw a coupe, now we're seeing a sedan.
A saloon.
Yeah, saloon. It's got 5 doors. No, I'm sorry, it's got 4 doors. I keep thinking it's a hatchback. It is not.
It looks like a freaking hatchback.
It does. That's because they designed it to be a hatchback and a saloon, so it's got that weird proportion. But anyway, let's get right to the meat and potatoes. Since we know all about this already, the Civic Si has some changes to it to make it more sporty from the regular Civic. And when we say sporty, we're talking about bigger brakes, especially from the last generation Civic. It's got much bigger rotors, which means there's a lot more overhead in braking. You have, for the first time in a Civic, adaptive dampers. And in the car, you technically have 2 modes, normal and sport. So you have kind of a normal ride experience, and then when you want to firm things up, you hit the sport button, which also changes other parameters in the vehicle.
Throttle response.
Yes.
It gives you a shift light.
Well, the shift light's always there, but it does make it glow red when you turn it into sport mode. I think once you drive it, you'll be...
You think it's cute?
I think it's very cute. It should have teddy bears that run across the screen too and say, I want a hug. The dampers are pretty well tuned. I think the only problem that I have with having these type of shocks or dampers in a car is it's really got 2 modes. And the other one is kind of variable, so it can kind of adjust itself. but I think it needs a third. I think it needs a soft, a medium, and a hard if you're going to go with this. Because if you want to go change these dampers, and this is the big problem with cars like this, is like it sounds cool, but if you want to change the suspension, then you got to do the damper emulation mode with a chip or something so that it doesn't throw an error code when you go to change it. And that's one of the things I don't like about a car like this in the price range. But from the factory, it's set up really well. I'm very impressed with it for the ride quality and everything. This looks like an absolute mess. But the thing is, with this multi-link rear, Scott, you have aluminum back here to reduce weight, some. You have an electronic parking brake, which on a manual transmission car is one of my least favorite things. It is so annoying. Like, I can't figure it out. I just want to I just want to get in, pull up the damn parking brake. Nope, you got to put your foot on the brake. You got to flip the toggle switches, which it's the same shape as the power windows. And of course, up is not down and down is not up.
Well, was I complaining about the other car, the Miata top?
Yeah, it's reversed.
It's up is not, it's stupid.
I would just give me a manual parking brake back. Why? And then you can't, I mean, there's no like modulation. What if I want to stop or roll? You know,
Doesn't it have hill start
Yeah, of course
assist?
it does, but whatever. Back in the back, we have adjustable, again, variable dampers, electronically controlled, much like the front, but the rear has been beefed up compared to the regular Civic.
It doesn't look beefed up at all.
No, I mean, well, I'm talking about spring rates and
I thought you meant
arbs.
structural.
No, the arbs and the spring rates are higher, and obviously the adaptive dampers, and then some of the bushings are changed. But in terms of the subframe, you know, you look at the control arms, and it does look super dinky back here. But I mean, really, all these cars in this price range, they're getting thinner and thinner. They figured out a way to make them more rigid with less materials. It's all about saving weight, and more specifically, talking about weight, this is 100 pounds less than the 9th generation Civic, and it's bigger. So they were able to really do a lot here in terms of structural rigidity. I think it's up 25 or 30% in structural rigidity compared to the previous generation, all while being lighter, which now is a good time to talk about the curb weights, Scott. Let's take a look at it on the scales.
Well, let's look at this exhaust, bro. It's one piece from the tailpipe all the way up there.
That's going to be a fun shipping cost to replace that. That's going to
Well,
cost.
I'm sure if you bought an aftermarket, it would have a flange, obviously, somewhere. But still, someone who wants to replace this in 25 years when it rots out, list price on it's $2,500.
Oh yeah, no,
It's gonna be worth more than the car.
Yeah, exactly. No, you're right. You make a good point. And you just the exhaust quality looks pretty good on here compared to a lot of cars. So hopefully it won't rot out. And of course, if you're in the Midwest, it doesn't matter anyway. It'll have a hole in it in 7 years.
No, the Honda's exhausts are pretty good.
Even the modern ones?
They probably got away with all the flanges because that's where all the Hondas go bad. But this thing's got, they're usually breaking around the welds, and this thing's got welds everywhere on it. So who knows?
It's one of those you just don't know. But how are the modern Hondas? Are they still?
Oh,
good?
like the CRVs.
Yeah.
The muffler flange will be rotted out, then it's rotted out of the cat, then it's rotted in front of the cat, then it needs AB, it needs the whole.
When they're multi-piece, though, you're talking about.
Right. I mean, we've had countless CRVs need from the manifold to the tailpipe. Because this piece is bad, well, now if you touch that, now that piece is bad, well, now I touch that, so you have to change everything.
Scott, we've just put the Honda Civic Si on the Longacre hybrid scales, and the curb weight is pretty much as directed, 2,920 pounds. And now we're going to talk about this mess under here.
It's not a mess.
It looks messy.
It does. It looks extremely messy.
It doesn't have a glamour cover.
I'm surprised. Probably there's so much freaking hood. They had to put a grab foam on a prop rod.
Oh, because the prop rod heats up so
And
much.
look, it's so hot. They even got fans up here.
Those aren't fans. Those are the new style clips, fan clips.
Oh,
They do look like fans, though. All right, so it's this. Okay, technically, it's not the same 1.5 liter in the Civic EX that we saw, but it is, but it's not. So they've made just a couple changes here, more than a couple. The headwork is totally different. The valves are sodium filled. The turbo is the same size, except the impeller's different because it creates more boost at the high RPM. It doesn't just fall flat on its face, but it's making about 200 pounds of torque and about 200 horsepower, really close to that. And they advertise that it'll hit 20 psi a boost, but most of the time it's between at least 16 and 17 at peak. I don't know if it's like an overboost at 20, but the big reason why you're probably not going to see this on the spec sheets, that this car is probably slower than it should be, is because second gear hits fuel cutoff at 57 miles an hour. It doesn't go all the way to 60, so you got to shift. So I'm sure it's losing time from that, because this feels absolutely more than adequate for a front-wheel drive car. I know they put more power with the Type R, but with the way that this is set up, with the limited slip that the Trans has, it's really, really good for a street car. I mean, it's not a sports car, but it is really fun to drive. And I said this in the earlier, well, I'm gonna say this. This is kind of my new favorite front-wheel drive compact. In terms of drivability, it's really good. Now,
That's some big words.
it is, because I really like the Mazda, and I like the Hyundai, the Elantra Sport too. This is much, much better. And a lot of it is mechanical changes to make it that good. We're going to take a drive in the new Honda Civic Si. We're going to see exactly how this car behaves. Is it enjoyable as an everyday car? How's the performance? And some of the quirks. Honda kind of helped to create this stigma or this popularity over the front-wheel drive compact car. They help to define what it means to have fun and have, good economy at the same time. And this new Civic is kind of not really connected too much with the past roots for Honda. No longer do you have naturally aspirated motors, but a lot of what's good about the Civic platform is still here. It rides good, it's practical, it's comfortable. You have a manual gearbox that's really enjoyable to use. But the one disappointment here, just an everyday driver, is this motor sounds like, it just sounds like nothing. It is so uninspiring, much like many of the modern turbo motors. You don't hear anything. It just sounds like a sewing machine. And despite their efforts to kind of spice up the exhaust, well, you don't hear that either. Now with sport mode on and traction control off, this offers a lot of fun. The steering sharper, the throttle response is sharper, and then the dampers go into a more firm setting. So the thing is, when you put it in sport, it's not like a night and day transition. The dampers don't get ridiculously hard where you're bouncing all over the road. There's still compliance. You could drive it in this mode almost all the time, but I choose not to usually. I usually keep the sport mode off, and it's totally fine. Even the power and performance is good. Now, people are obsessed with performance figures, and on a car like this, it's just not going to blow you away. You have a turbocharged 1.5 liter, which means you don't have a ton of power. But if you want to go from a start, this car is totally adequate for the street. There's minimal torque steer, and it gets going really well. There's a little tire spin. The fuel cutoff is at 57 miles per hour in second gear, so that's partially why you're going to see a little bit of a problem with the 0 to 60 numbers. You have to make a third shift. This car is deceivingly quick despite the 0 to 60 numbers, and you have so much torque, you have so much thrust at the lower RPM. It's not like the old Hondas where you had to rev them out. Now, the only disappointment here is because of the way the turbo is tuned on here, it does make power all the way to the red line, which is great, except fuel cutoff comes up so quick that you just want it to rev more. The next is the engine. It always feels satisfying. For street driving, you couldn't want anything more. There's just always torque. There's always that surge that you feel when you're just quarter throttle. And on the highway, you don't have to wind it out. And partially, that's the reason why I'm getting 34 to 35 miles per gallon all the time. And that is an incredible number for how much fun I've been having driving this. There's almost no penalty as a compact car to driving it a little bit harder. The brakes are really adequate, but like I said, you can hear the ABS coming on or almost coming on really quickly because of these tires. And I find that it's kind of a non-issue. It's a good balance because when you get into these sportier tires, you have to change them a lot if you drive, like a maniac. And for running costs, for a car this cheap, you don't want the high running costs of sticky tires. I think the sticky tires would definitely help the traction and fun factor, but you're still gonna probably start to overwhelm the chassis. It's gonna upset the balance, and of course, you're gonna create more understeer under like 9/10s, 10/10s driving. I think this might be a fun autocross car, but I think you're gonna have to change some, you're probably gonna have to do a camber kit in the front to get the most out of it. In terms of track driving, I've had it on the track. I'm pretty impressed with it overall. Again, it's something you're gonna drive at 7, 8, maybe 9/10s and really enjoy. This is a good first performance car for somebody who's younger. It's a good daily driver for somebody that just wants a little bit of fun, good fuel efficiency, and is not a total putter. Now let's talk about some of the other things. Steering feel. I don't have a problem with electronic power steering. I've been used to it for the past 20 years or so. It is numb on every car, and every manufacturer typically makes it numb on purpose because they don't want you to feel NVH. They don't want vibration through the steering wheel because 95% of car buyers associate feeling through the steering wheel as a bad thing. So it's purposely dumbed down a lot of times. I think there's it's a good balance here between road feel, quick ratio steering. I'd rather take a little bit of numbness in electronic power steering than a hydraulic power steering rack with feel that feels like you're driving a school bus in terms of slow ratios. Now, there's one problem with this car. That is, when you shift at the higher RPM and you get into some of these harder shifts, it's always cutting timing at the top end. It's really hard to get a first to second gear shift without it cutting timing into the next gear, and that tends to slow it down. The other thing you'll hear about is rev hang with the Civic, and a lot of that is because of tuning, some of it's because of emissions, but it does get a little bit tiring after a while if you want to drive more aggressively. But again, with how much torque and power there is at the lower RPM, you don't have to wind this thing out. Again, it's a car that is satisfying when you're quarter or half throttle in most gears. Now, something that I've noticed with this car is if you're driving around in 4th or 5th gear and you're at like 45 or 55 miles an hour, what you're gonna notice is surging. There's a lot of surging with this car where you feel this kind of like herky-jerky, and a lot of that has to do with tuning. You can tell it when you're in that torque, when you're right in that area where there's a lot of torque, that turbo's kind of spooled up, you have to be in 5th or 6th gear almost all the time to avoid it. You can't drive around in 3rd and 4th gear like you would with a naturally aspirated car. It just doesn't seem to like it that much, and it becomes just an annoying experience. Here we go, the conclusion of the Civic Si. And I have to tell you, I'm a current owner of a 6th generation Civic. I also own an Si. I've owned 12 Hondas in the past 15 years. So you could say I'm a loyalist maybe, but not really, because I'm not a huge fan of modern Honda, namely what they've done with their sports cars. I think they've gone off the deep end and lost connection with their roots. So where does that leave me with this car? I have to say straight up, this is the best Honda Civic that's ever been made. It blends so many things with the past, with the present, and it combines all of it into a great package to drive every day. This is not a sports car. It's not designed to be that, but when you're driving it on the street, not only do you get amazing fuel economy, but you get the power and torque that just driving around every day that is more than adequate with front wheel drive. And the biggest thing here is adding a limited slip differential. Where the regular Civics fail, this picks up so much by being able to put the power down to the wheels and not feel like a mess when you're in the turns. It just balances everything so well in terms of comfort, refinement, drivability, handling, performance, braking. It is a complete package, and why I think this is the best compact car on the market today. It finally overtakes the Mazda 3 for me, the Elantra Sport. This is better than a GTI, pretty much anything else out there. If you can get over some of the quirks in styling, if you can get past that this is a modern Honda, they finally kind of returned to where they need to be. Now it's just a matter, is this thing gonna hold up? Is this motor gonna be reliable with the new turbo on it? And that's something that only time will tell. So take it for what it's worth. I look forward to hearing your comments on it. Take care.